Ever find yourself staring at your software testing plan and thinking, is this enough? Am I missing something?
Happens all the time. It's like trying to figure out how many sprinkles are enough for an ice cream cone. You want enough, but not too many.
Right. Today, we're tackling test coverage. Figuring out how much testing is enough without going overboard and ending up in a testing spiral. It's about balancing quality with efficiency, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we'll unpack today. What test coverage actually is, the different types, why that magical 100% figure isn't always the goal, and how to land on the right amount for your specific project.
Buckle up because we're going deep. Real-world examples, best practices, the works. By the end, you'll have a solid framework for approaching your own testing challenges.
All right, let's jump in. So what exactly are we talking about when we say test coverage?
Well, in the simplest terms, it's a measure of how much of your code, features, even those initial requirements you set out to meet. How much of all that is actually being exercised by your tests?
Think of it as a spotlight. It shines a light on the areas of your application your tests have touched, showing you the nooks and crannies that haven't been explored yet.
And this helps us understand where we might be missing tests and have potential vulnerabilities, right?
Exactly. But here's a crucial point to remember. 100% test coverage doesn't automatically mean you've squashed every single bug.
Oh, the myth of 100%. Test everything and ship perfect software, right?
Right. But coverage just tells you what parts of your code have been run by the tests. It doesn't reveal how effective those tests are at actually finding problems.
So, imagine you have security cameras in every corner of a building, but they're all pointed at the ceiling. You have full camera coverage, but zero actual security.
A perfect analogy. Coverage is just one piece of the puzzle. Now let's break down the different ways to measure this coverage. Think of these as different lenses we can use to examine our software.
Okay, guide us through these lenses. What are the main types of test coverage?
We'll start with the foundation.code coverage. This focuses on how much of your actual source code is executed during your testing.
So we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of the code itself. What are the levels we're talking about here?
The most basic is statement coverage. It checks if every single line of code in your program has been run at least once during testing.
So if a function has 20 lines of code, statement coverage ensures all 20 are executed at some point.
You got it. But statement coverage is a bit, basic. Think about an if-else statement. If your test only triggers the if block, you technically have 100% statement coverage.
Because every line in that block was run,
But you haven't tested what happens when the else block is triggered. That's where branch coverage steps in.
So branch coverage ensures every possible outcome of a decision in the code is tested.
Exactly. It tests all the forks in the road, so to speak. Then we have path coverage. This is about testing every unique sequence of steps the code can take.
That sounds comprehensive.
Yeah.
But if you have lots of if statements and loops, the number of paths could be huge, right?
Absolutely. Path coverage is the most thorough. But in practice, especially in large systems, it can be, impossible to test every single path.
Okay, so code coverage gives us that low-level view of the code execution. What's the next lens?
Shifting gears, we have functional coverage. This focuses on the software's behavior from the user's perspective, the features, the scenarios they go through, the business needs it's supposed to fulfill.
So it's less about the internal code and more about what the user actually experiences and whether the software does what it's designed to do.
Precisely. Let's say you're building an e-commerce site. Functional coverage would look at whether you have tests covering things like searching for products, adding them to the cart, the whole checkout process, the core user journey.
Makes sense. Code coverage checks under the hood. Functional coverage checks the user-facing stuff. What's next?
Next is test case coverage. This is about the connection between your individual test cases and the requirements they're supposed to address.
So if you have a requirement, like users should be able to log in with a valid email and password,
You'd assess whether you have test cases for various scenarios. Correct email, wrong password, empty fields.
right, making sure you've covered all the bases. And this helps us identify potential gaps in our testing, right?
Exactly. You might realize you haven't covered things like, what happens if someone enters a non-existent email or tries to log in too many times? Test case coverage helps you plug those holes.
Great way to think about it. What's our final lens?
We end with risk-based coverage. This prioritizes testing based on the potential business and technical risks associated with different parts of the application.
So we're not treating every feature or line of code with the same level of importance when it comes to testing.
Right. Some areas are simply more critical than others. Risk-based coverage acknowledges this and says, let's focus our energy on the areas where failures would have the biggest impact.
Like in a banking app, the transaction processing and security features would need much more rigorous testing than, say, the section where you change your profile picture.
Precisely. The consequences of a failure in those critical areas are much greater, so we allocate our resources accordingly.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, let's circle back to the 100% coverage myth. We know it doesn't guarantee perfect software, but are there cases where aiming for it is the right move?
There are absolutely situations where striving for near-perfect coverage is essential, often even mandatory. These are typically systems where the consequences of failure are very high.
Okay, give us some examples of these high-stakes situations.
Well, the most obvious are safety-critical systems, software controlling medical devices, aviation systems, things like that, where a bug could have devastating consequences.
You definitely don't want to cut corners when lives are potentially on the line.
Right. Rigorous testing with the highest possible coverage is absolutely non-negotiable in those cases. Then there's regulatory compliance. Industries like healthcare and finance have strict standards that often dictate the level of testing required.
So it's not just about avoiding bugs for quality's sake, but also about meeting legal and industry requirements.
Exactly. Failing to comply can result in huge fines and damage to your reputation. Outside of these specific scenarios, though, striving for 100% can be a real headache.
Because it's often impractical and might not even be the most efficient use of resources, right? Why is that?
For one thing, dynamic applications with lots of user interface changes. Trying to maintain 100% UI test coverage is like chasing a moving target. UI tests tend to break easily, even with small visual tweaks, and you end up constantly updating and maintaining them.
Oh, I can imagine the frustration. Every time you change a button, a whole bunch of tests go haywire.
Precisely. Another reason is system complexity. The more complex your system, the more path that the code can take, the more interactions there are to test. Trying to achieve 100% coverage across all that, well, this effort might not be worth the payoff.
So the million-dollar question becomes, how do we figure out what level of coverage is enough? Is there a rule of thumb we can follow?
Unfortunately, there's no magic formula. It's all about context. However, there are some strategies that can guide us.
Okay, give us those guiding lights. What are the key things to consider?
The most important strategy is prioritizing critical areas. As we talked about with risk-based coverage, you need to identify the parts of the application that are most crucial to the business and the user, the areas where failures would have the biggest negative impact.
So back to our banking app, the core login, transaction features, those get more attention than a settings page that's rarely used.
Exactly. The consequences of a failure in those core areas are much higher. So focus your most intense testing efforts there.
Okay, that's a good starting point. What else should we be thinking about?
Next, we want to employ a balanced testing approach. Different types of tests require different coverage targets. For example, you typically aim for higher coverage with unit tests than with UI tests.
Let's break that down a bit. What kind of coverage targets should we be aiming for with different types of tests?
For unit tests, which test individual pieces of code in isolation, aiming for around 70-80% coverage of your critical code paths is a good starting point. For integration tests, which check how different parts of the system work together, a range of 40-50% for those crucial interactions can be effective. And for UI tests, which mimic user interactions with the interface, a lower target of 20-30% is often more practical.
Why the lower target for UI tests?
Because UI tests are more prone to breaking with changes in the interface, so maintaining higher coverage can be a real drain on resources.
Got it. Any real-world examples of companies using this kind of balanced approach effectively?
Think about Google Chrome. They're known for having really high unit test coverage for their core engine, making sure the foundation is solid. But their UI tests are more focused, concentrating on essential user workflows rather than trying to test every single button and element.
Makes sense. It's about being strategic with your resources. What else should we keep in mind?
Another key is strategic test automation. Automation is fantastic for repetitive tasks, like regression testing to make sure old bugs don't creep back in.
Right. Automating those tedious, repetitive tests is a lifesaver.
Exactly. But you don't want to automate everything.
So there are cases where manual testing is still the better option.
Absolutely. Prioritize automating tests for stable, important features that you'll run frequently. For features that change often or have a lower impact if they fail, manual testing might be more efficient.
Like in our social media app example, you'd automate the login and posting features, but probably not the tests for how the app looks with different color themes.
Exactly. Lastly, track your coverage metrics, but don't be ruled by them. Tools like Jacoco, SonarCube, and Jest can provide valuable data about your coverage.
So these tools help us visualize which parts of our code have been tested.
Yes. But remember, these numbers are just indicators. A high coverage number doesn't automatically mean your tests are good at finding bugs. Focus on writing high-quality, effective test cases.
Right. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the quality of the tests themselves. Now, let's look at how some companies have tackled this in the real world.
Learning from others' experiences is invaluable. Let's start with Netflix.
Okay, what did the streaming giant learn about finding the right test coverage balance?
They ran into a problem where their extensive UI tests were slowing down their releases. They realized they were spending a lot of time testing minor UI tweaks that didn't really affect the core streaming and recommendation features.
So they were testing things that didn't really matter that much from a user perspective. What did they do?
They shifted to a risk-based testing strategy, focusing on the features that were truly critical to their business. By prioritizing their testing this way, they managed to reduce their testing time by about 40% without sacrificing quality where it mattered most.
That's a huge time saving. What about a company like Amazon with its massive e-commerce platform? How do they handle testing at that scale?
Given the sheer size of Amazon's platform, trying to maintain UI tests for everything would be a nightmare. They realized that relying too much on UI tests was leading to flaky tests and high maintenance costs.
Flaky tests, meaning the results weren't always reliable.
Right, so they strategically focused on getting about 80% coverage from API and back-end tests. This allowed them to thoroughly test the core logic and functionality of their platform in a more efficient and reliable way.
So they shifted the focus away from the user interface and towards the underlying systems where changes are less frequent.
Exactly. And this allowed them to still have confidence in the quality of their platform without being bogged down by UI test maintenance.
Now, earlier we talked about a banking app and regulatory compliance. How did the need to meet those strict standards affect their testing approach?
For a banking app, achieving high test coverage in areas related to security and financial transactions is absolutely crucial. In one case, a team working on a banking app achieved over 90% code coverage in the modules responsible for transaction security to meet those regulatory requirements.
So they really had to go all in on testing for those critical parts of the application.
Right, but they also realized that the same level of coverage wasn't needed for less sensitive areas, like user profile settings. In those areas, they could take a more risk-based approach and rely more on UI testing for specific user flows.
These examples show that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to the test coverage question. It's all about being strategic and adapting your approach based on your specific context.
Absolutely. Now, let's distill this down to some actionable steps our listeners can take to optimize their own testing.
Love it. Give us those practical takeaways.
First and foremost, focus on your business-critical features. Align your testing strategy with what truly matters to your business and your users. Test the features where failures would have the most impact.
Makes sense. Protect the heart of your application. What's next?
Next, adopt a risk-based approach. Constantly evaluate and prioritize your testing efforts based on the potential risks associated with different parts of your system.
So it's an ongoing assessment, not a one-time thing.
Exactly. Third, find that sweet spot between manual and automated testing. Automation is powerful, but it's not a silver bullet. Combine it strategically with manual testing to get a comprehensive view of your application's quality.
A blended approach is key. What else should we remember?
Review and optimize your tests regularly. Just like your code, your tests need to be maintained. Get rid of tests that are no longer relevant or effective.
Keep your test suite lean and mean. And the final piece of advice.
Focus on the effectiveness of your tests, not just the coverage numbers. Don't chase arbitrary percentages. Write tests that actually find and prevent bugs, that give you real confidence in the quality of your software.
Quality over quantity when it comes to tests. That's a great takeaway. So to wrap up our deep dive, test coverage is crucial, but 100% isn't always the answer. The goal is to find the right balance, the level of coverage that gives you confidence without slowing you down.
Well said. It's about understanding your unique context, your risks, your priorities, and tailoring your approach accordingly.
This has been a really insightful look into the world of test coverage. I'm definitely walking away with a much clearer understanding of how to approach it strategically.
I hope so. The key is to be thoughtful and deliberate, always keeping the needs of your users and the goals of your business in mind.
And on that note, here's a question to leave you with. How does your team define critical in the context of your application? What data are you using to assess risk and prioritize testing efforts? Something to think about as you navigate your own testing journeys. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.